It was a warm Saturday afternoon, the 12th of June 2010, in one of Atlanta's most prestigious suburbs. The day was filled with sunshine, and the gentle breeze rustled the tall trees that lined the manicured lawns of the upscale neighborhood. At the Harrison mansion, preparations for an important family event were well underway. The house, with its white columns and grand facade, stood as a beacon of luxury. Inside, everything was in its place, reflecting the high status and wealth the Harrison family had attained. Grace Harrison, the lady of the house, had meticulously planned this family reunion. The mansion itself was an architectural marvel, designed in the style of classical colonial grandeur. The entrance was marked by a massive oak door with intricate stained glass panels that allowed just the right amount of light to filter through. Inside, the living room boasted marble floors that shone like mirrors. The walls were adorned with large, elegant paintings, and antique furniture filled the space, all carefully chosen to convey wealth and taste. In the backyard, a pristine pool shimmered in the sunlight, and tables with fine linens were set up under a white canopy. The evening promised an atmosphere of luxury and sophistication. Grace Harrison was the picture of elegance. At 38 years old, she possessed an ageless beauty, with dark brown hair styled flawlessly, and a tall, graceful figure that added to her refined appearance. She exuded poise as she moved through the house, checking on the last-minute preparations. Grace was known for her ability to host perfect gatherings, always ensuring her guests felt welcome and attended to. But despite her outward composure, the smile on her face concealed a deep anxiety, one she had learned to hide well. Grace had always prided herself on being the perfect wife and mother, keeping a beautiful home and raising two children who seemed to have it all. However, beneath this carefully constructed image, anxiety gnawed at her. The years of maintaining the perfect appearance in public were taking a toll. She feared that if she allowed even a crack in the facade, the life she had worked so hard to build would fall apart. She obsessed over every detail. The silverware had to be placed just right, the guests needed to be greeted with perfect warmth, and no one could know that behind the scenes things weren't as perfect as they seemed. The Harrison family was the epitome of success in the eyes of the world. David Harrison, Grace's husband, was a well-known and highly respected attorney. His career was flourishing, and he was frequently seen at high-profile legal events and social gatherings, hobnobbing with influential figures. Their children, Emily and Alex, were the pride of the family. Emily, 16, was a talented pianist who regularly performed at prestigious competitions. Alex, 12, was a budding athlete with dreams of becoming a professional baseball player. To everyone who looked at them, the Harrisons were living the American dream, a model of success and happiness. As Grace Harrison went about her day preparing for the family reunion, the atmosphere inside the Harrison mansion felt unusually tense. It wasn't just the bustling activity of arranging things for the guests. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the air that Grace couldn't ignore. Her husband, David, was unusually distant. He had been working late for weeks and barely acknowledged her presence in the house. His cold demeanor gnawed at Grace, yet she did her best to push it aside. Her concerns were dismissed with polite smiles, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the hours passed and the guests began to arrive, the tension built, though it remained hidden beneath the surface of the evening's festivities. The illusion of the perfect family was beginning to crumble. To the outside world, the Harrisons were everything anyone could aspire to be, a wealthy, beautiful couple with two picture-perfect children, living in a mansion that spoke of success. But behind closed doors, things were far less idyllic. Grace's thoughts often returned to the quiet resentment that had started to grow between her and David. He had once been her rock, but now he was a stranger, emotionally unavailable and increasingly unkind. Grace had tried to keep up the appearance of a happy wife, but her anxiety was growing, and it seemed like everyone could feel it. Even the guests who came to the party could sense the distance between the couple. As the reunion continued, Grace couldn't ignore how fragile her marriage had become. In conversations with her friends, David's name came up, and though they spoke highly of him, Grace could feel the words ringing hollow. His late nights at work were beginning to feel like an excuse for his avoidance. His warmth, once effortless and constant, had become strained, and their interactions had grown clipped and curt. Grace could no longer pretend everything was fine. Even her once perfect home, which she had always kept pristine to mask her discomfort, began to feel like a cage. No matter how much she tried to keep things together, she knew the facade was slowly cracking. Grace thought back to when she and David had first met. They were young, fresh out of college, and their future seemed so bright. David had been charismatic, ambitious, and supportive, encouraging her dreams while making her feel like the most important person in his world. The early days of their marriage had been filled with laughter, late-night talks, and the excitement of building a life together. But as the years passed, the dynamic between them began to shift. David's career took off, and his ambition seemed to outweigh everything else. Grace, too, had focused on raising their children, but as her world revolved more around the home, David seemed more distant, more focused on his career than their family. As years passed, Grace began to notice a subtle yet undeniable shift in David's behavior. The warm, attentive husband she had married was starting to fade. David, who once made time for family dinners, romantic weekends, and long, meaningful conversations, now seemed increasingly distracted. He started coming home later and later from work, often citing meetings or urgent projects. When he was at home, he appeared distant, his eyes focused on his phone or his work, barely acknowledging Grace or their children. His moods fluctuated more frequently, shifting from irritability to indifference. Grace couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it started, but it was clear. David's priorities had changed and his focus was elsewhere. She began to suspect that it wasn't just work that was consuming him. Something or someone was pulling his attention away from her and their family. For years, Grace chose to remain silent, enduring the emotional distance that had crept into her marriage. She tried to convince herself that it was just a rough patch, a phase caused by the pressures of work or parenting. She focused on the children, her friends, and the charity events she hosted, burying her dissatisfaction under a veneer of perfection. But deep inside, the loneliness was gnawing at her. Grace yearned for the affectionate, loving husband she once had, but she couldn't find a way to reach him. Their conversations became short, their interactions limited to pleasantries. The silence between them grew louder, and she found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had gone wrong. It wasn't just the emotional neglect, it was the loneliness of living in the same house with someone who had become a stranger. Yet, for the sake of maintaining their public image, Grace chose to endure in silence. On the outside, David's life continued to appear flawless. He was a successful lawyer, known for his sharp intellect and prestigious clients. His public image was carefully curated, and he was always seen at charity galas, giving speeches at events, and attending high-profile meetings. He was the ideal figure in their social circle, admired by peers and respected by colleagues. His charm, confidence, and polished appearance made him seem untouchable. Meanwhile, Grace played her role as the perfect wife, always smiling at public events, accompanying him to social gatherings, and maintaining the facade of a happy family. But behind closed doors, the cracks in David's image were beginning to show. His behavior toward Grace became colder, and his once strong commitment to their family seemed to dissipate, replaced by a growing indifference. The breaking point came when Grace could no longer ignore the signs of betrayal. For years, she had tried to preserve the image of a perfect family, swallowing her growing suspicions about David's behavior. She noticed the little things, his increasing detachment, his prolonged absences, and the way his eyes seemed to wander whenever he was around other women. But it wasn't until a quiet evening at home, when Grace saw an unmarked envelope containing a text from a number she didn't recognize, that everything clicked into place. Her stomach churned as she read the words, "Can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you." The letter was enough to shatter the last of her denial. Grace was faced with a painful truth. David was having an affair. The perfect illusion of their life together had crumbled in an instant. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She had reached her breaking point, no longer willing to remain in a marriage built on lies and betrayal. The fateful party, which was supposed to be a joyful celebration, turned into a nightmare for Grace. It was an upscale affair, full of influential people from both David's professional and social circles. Grace had worked hard to ensure everything was perfect, arranging the catering, picking the venue, and attending to every detail. However, as the evening unfolded, she couldn't shake the tension in the air, and all her efforts to keep everything in place seemed futile. David's behavior was unnerving. He was overly familiar with Samantha, a younger woman from his firm, paying her an inordinate amount of attention. Every time Grace looked in their direction, they were whispering, laughing, and exchanging glances. Grace's gut told her there was more to their connection than simple business camaraderie. As the night progressed, she felt the sting of humiliation. Her husband was clearly more focused on Samantha than on her or their family. The party, once a highlight of their social calendar, had become the moment Grace realized the truth. David's affair was no longer something she could ignore or deny. The affair was exposed when Grace confronted David privately after the party. At first, he denied it, offering weak excuses about working late or attending professional events, but Grace could see through his lies. In a final attempt to salvage his dignity, he told her that it was nothing serious, just a passing fling. But Grace wasn't fooled. She had already gathered enough evidence, reading texts and noticing small details that spoke volumes. He had been seeing Samantha for months, and now the truth hung heavy in the air. Grace's anger erupted in full force. She had been betrayed by the person she loved most, and the hurt was almost unbearable. The weight of David's infidelity crushed her, but the real sting was the realization that her marriage had been nothing more than a carefully constructed facade, one she could no longer uphold. The confrontation between Grace and David was a turning point. Grace could no longer tolerate the lies and betrayal, so she decided to confront him head-on. It wasn't a quiet, emotional conversation. It was raw, heated, and emotional. Grace had gathered enough evidence over the weeks, messages, emails, and subtle clues that confirmed her worst fears. She was furious but resolute. David, caught off guard, initially tried to deflect and deny it. He acted like the whole thing was a misunderstanding, attempting to downplay the affair by claiming it was nothing serious, just a brief lapse in judgment. But Grace, with a mixture of hurt and fury, rejected his excuses. She reminded him of everything they had built together, the trust, the family, and the years of commitment. In the heat of the moment, David could no longer lie. He admitted to the affair, though he continued to trivialize it. Grace, devastated by his lack of remorse, knew then that their marriage was beyond saving. The discovery of the affair was a moment of painful clarity for Grace. For months, she had noticed subtle changes in David's behavior, his late nights at work, his growing emotional distance, and the way he became increasingly secretive. She tried to convince herself that these were just signs of stress or work pressure, but deep down, she sensed something was wrong. One day, while going through the family files in a desperate attempt to find clarity, Grace stumbled upon the final piece of the puzzle, an unread text on David's phone. The message was from a woman named Samantha, someone Grace had never heard of. It was intimate and flirtatious, full of longing and promises of secret rendezvous. Grace's heart sank as she read the message, but the truth hit her hard. She had been right all along. Her husband, the man she trusted, had been having an affair for months. The emotional pain of that discovery was unbearable. Her world shattered, and the carefully constructed image of her perfect family fell apart in an instant. The final showdown between Grace and David was inevitable. After the discovery of the affair, Grace's anger and heartbreak reached a boiling point. She couldn't bear to live in denial anymore. Their marriage had been built on lies, and now she demanded accountability. When she confronted David, the emotional intensity of the situation left no room for compromise. David tried to justify his actions, playing the victim and claiming that the affair was an escape from the pressures he had been facing, but Grace wasn't having it. The betrayal was too deep, and her heart couldn't bear any more lies. She told him that their marriage was over and there was no coming back. There were no apologies from David, just regret, but it was too late. The final showdown wasn't just a confrontation, it was Grace's declaration that she would no longer tolerate the emotional neglect and dishonesty. It marked the emotional end of their marriage. In the aftermath of the confrontation, Grace had to face the reality of her new life. She filed for divorce, but the process was far from simple. Their home, once filled with laughter and love, now felt cold and foreign. The children, though shielded from the worst of the situation, could sense the tension. Grace, despite her hurt, was determined to make the transition as smooth as possible for them. But the emotional toll on her was immense. The pain of betrayal was all-consuming, and she found herself grieving not only the end of her marriage, but also the loss of the family she had worked so hard to create. The public exposure of David's affair added another layer of stress. His social and professional circles began to gossip, and Grace had to find strength to face the judgment that came with it. Still, she refused to let the aftermath define her. She took one day at a time, finding small ways to heal, focusing on herself and her children. The turning point for Grace came when she realized that she could no longer live in the shadow of David's betrayal. The pain was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She started therapy, working through the deep emotional wounds inflicted by the affair. It was during this time that Grace realized that she had been so focused on her role as David's wife and mother to their children that she had neglected her own identity. She had lost herself in the marriage and in her desire to maintain the perfect image of a family, but now, for the first time in years, she had the chance to rediscover who she was without the constraints of her marriage. This was her opportunity to redefine herself, and she grasped it. She focused on healing, learning to love herself again, and gradually regaining the confidence that had been eroded over the years. It was a long process, but Grace knew this was the turning point. She had begun the journey of reclaiming her life and her happiness. David's actions had consequences, and the final one came when his personal and professional life completely unraveled. Grace's decision to stand up for herself despite the pain caused a ripple effect. Once the affair was exposed, David's image as a respected businessman and family man began to disintegrate. His colleagues, once loyal, began to distance themselves, and rumors about his infidelity began to spread in the press. His marriage to Grace, which had been the public symbol of success and stability, was now a cautionary tale. David faced the loss of his career, his friends, and his social standing. His emotional and professional decline was swift and harsh. The affair, once a private betrayal, had now become a public scandal. The final consequence of his actions was the complete destruction of the life he had carefully crafted. It was a painful irony for David, who had once seemed untouchable. The fall from grace was severe, and he could no longer hide behind the image of a perfect family. The emotional fallout of the affair didn't stop with the divorce. As David became more desperate to win Grace back, his behavior became erratic and aggressive. One evening, during an intense argument, David's temper flared, and Grace feared for her safety. David had never been physically abusive, but his emotional volatility was escalating, and she knew it was time to act. Grace called the police, and the officers arrived quickly to defuse the situation. The confrontation with the police marked a dramatic shift in Grace's relationship with David. It was no longer just about the affair, it was about protecting herself and her children from the emotional abuse that had become part of their daily lives. The police intervened, and David was escorted from the home. For Grace, this was the final step in reclaiming her autonomy. She was no longer afraid to stand up for herself and make sure she and her children were safe, even if that meant involving law enforcement. David's arrest was a sobering moment. His volatile behavior and the confrontation with Grace had escalated to a point where the authorities felt it was necessary to take action. The arrest came as a shock to David. The man who had once been admired by many was now facing legal consequences for his actions. The arrest was a public humiliation, and it sealed the reality of his downfall. Grace, though relieved by the police intervention, didn't feel any satisfaction in seeing David's life fall apart. She had never wanted revenge. She simply wanted peace and closure. The arrest marked the end of his attempts to manipulate the situation and take control of their lives again. The trial was an emotional ordeal for Grace, though it wasn't about the affair anymore. It was about the emotional abuse and manipulation that David had subjected her to over the years. She took the stand and testified about the toll the affair had taken on her, recounting the years of emotional neglect and the pain of watching her marriage unravel. David tried to downplay his actions, but the evidence against him was irrefutable. He had betrayed her trust, and now the world knew. The trial became a platform for Grace to reclaim her voice, to tell her story, and to hold David accountable for the emotional suffering he had caused. The conviction was a hard-won victory. While it couldn't undo the pain, it gave Grace a sense of justice. David's actions had consequences, and the court had seen fit to punish him for them. David's downfall was a slow, painful process. After the trial, he lost everything that had once defined him. His business collapsed as clients and colleagues distanced themselves from him. His reputation, once pristine, was now marred by the affair and the emotional abuse he had inflicted on Grace. His social standing evaporated, and even his family, though initially supportive, began to distance themselves. David's emotional and professional decline was swift. He was no longer the man who had it all. Now he was a man dealing with the fallout of his own actions. It was a brutal reminder that betrayal and deceit have lasting consequences. The verdict in the trial was a defining moment. Grace, despite the emotional toll it had taken on her, felt a sense of closure. The court ruled in her favor, granting her full custody of their children and significant financial support. The divorce was finalized, and Grace felt as if she had finally been given the opportunity to start over. The verdict wasn't just a legal decision, it was a symbolic victory. It represented the end of David's hold over her life. She was free to move on, to heal, and to rebuild. Grace's new beginning was a journey of rediscovery and self-healing. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. She focused on her children children, providing them with the stability and love they needed to adjust to their new lives. She also dedicated time to herself, pursuing old passions, taking up new hobbies, and building a network of supportive friends. Slowly, Grace regained her confidence and strength. She rebuilt her career and began to create a life that was truly her own. Her sense of self-worth, once tied to her marriage, was now anchored in her own abilities and the love she had for her children. Grace's new beginning was more than just moving on from the past. It was about taking control of her future and finding happiness on her own terms.